Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all from wherever you're listening in from. It is your host Diego Ife, and you are listening to another recording from the Boon Podcast. Thank you for listening to it. Please kindly like, reshare, subscribe if you haven't already, and do drop your comments. I'd love to hear your feedback. So I'm just going to dive into the topic that I'm covering on this recording, and it is really to do with the gender war, particularly the black gender war, and also the idea of it being a zero-sum game. Ultimately, what is the end goal? What's the likely outcomes, so to speak? Now, it's a topic that I don't want to be simplistic on. Certain people have taken the view that, why can't we just get along? We should get along. That's one school of thought. The other one is that it's irreparably done. Sorry, let me just repeat that one more time. Irreparably done. Okay, I got it. So they're I'd say the two school of thoughts that mostly prevail, at least in the spaces I've listened to content, with regards to the gender war. Whether that's across YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, IG, you name it. It's replete. I think it's even partly seeped into the mainstream, if you will. You can look at it in so many different ways, I suppose. If one wants to take a snapshot and go, some decades back, the building blocks of this division, if you will, goes back probably to, it depends on which country you're referring to, but I'm going to make reference to the US to a degree just because its influence on a popular cultural level tends to be what I'll call centrifugal. It literally, like, the US is the center of the popular culture, and then from that point onward it just kind of just manages to metastasize. Okay, so if we're going to look at it from, you have the likes of the film Waiting to Excel, you have the likes of The Color Purple, all of the talk shows that used to go on from like the 80s through up to, well, I'd even say up to now, if I'm being honest, the likes of Oprah. She is like the mascot, the avatar for this, but also others like Ricky Lake, Sally Jesse Raphael, Montel Williams, who's the other one? I think I said Ricky Lake already. Anyway, you get the gist. It's within that kind of range, and also within popular culture. So the idea of like R&B songs, which are kind of simpish, you'd have guys that will be trying to emulate this stuff, singing it in front of the mirror. I'm sure you get the picture, right? And just a lot of simping and a lot of portrayals of men, black men in particular, in a negative light. The shaming kind of culture as well. Whether we're talking about Scrubs from TLC, to a certain extent some of the lyrics on the Destiny's Child's first album, Pay My Bills, and all that other stuff. And there's a few others, but those are the ones that come to mind in any case. So seeing as like a key part of the black identity is through the lenses of popular culture, right? And that's not just in America, mind you, that's in the UK. You'll find that even in places like Nigeria, where I have quite a bit of familiarity with, and popular culture is at the epicenter of being black. Now, you remove popular culture, let's just say everybody knows what they have, what they've been exposed to, what they've consumed. Imagine if you removed every single last trace of popular cultural content over the last 5 or 6 decades, all of it, no traces whatsoever. It would occasion maybe an identity crisis. Do you understand? So that just kind of underscores how important popular culture is to the black experience. And ultimately, let's look at it. How relationships are, formed. How people tend to view one another is very much through the lenses of popular culture. If for whatever reason you're found wanting when it comes down to demonstrating an understanding of things, that can even kill a potential friendship before it's begun. Certain people would render you as, otherworldly for not knowing who so-and-so is, whether it's, I don't know, Megan Thee Stallion, or whether it's the Real Housewives of this or it's the fake Housewives of that. There's just a plethora and I guess a proliferation of such content which tends to center on, you know, popular culture, right? And I'll say one thing with regards to like American popular culture and stuff and what have you. We know, and I think this is irrefutable, where we're looking at like the black nationalist politics, it really was incubated in the US. Whether you're looking at, I don't want to be digressive and be all over the place, but there's a point that I'm making here. Whether we're looking at the likes of Marcus Garvey, who found that the US was a fertile ground for, you know, disseminating a black first, you know, agenda, right? Marcus Garvey's influence was so wide reaching that in random villages as far back as the 1930s, random villages in what we now know as north central Nigeria or the Middle Belt, you had people singing his praises. That should tell you how far it's traveled. You look at the likes of Kwame Nkrumah, who studied in the US, I think it was at Lincoln University if I'm not mistaken, and I think there might have been another one. And you know, much of his Pan-Africanism was incubated in Harlem. That was around the mid-1940s when he really started to refine his kind of take on Pan-Africanism. I'm sure you get the point. Where I'm going with this. You had your civil rights leaders, the likes of Martin Luther King, who used to travel to Africa. Not many people know this because obviously he's typically referred to in the US for the work that he's done in the US, which is rightly so, but he did have a link to the continent. Malcolm X, also we know that he did as well. In fact, in many ways, his travels there and elsewhere was what kind of influenced him to turn away from the Nation of Islam and pursue a more mainstream, you know, Sunnah kind of Islam, right? And then you look at the Black Panthers. I'm talking about the US one because there was a UK arm, and you know, once they disbanded, because they were a position of strength, they were like a cornerstone of, you know, the community, if you will, when it came down to their free breakfast clubs, the acquisition of arms. And, you know, even though they were funded to a degree by white liberals, you know, is it Huey P. Newton, you know, he was pretty close to them and he did receive, you know, some generous support from them, but nevertheless, it was certainly a symbol of hope for black Americans. And then what now happened is when they disbanded, Malcolm X obviously was, you know, bumped off. Likewise, Martin Luther King. You know, other than a few people that were perhaps familiar with, is it Khalil Muhammad, if I'm not mistaken, his name, the father of is it Farron Gray? Anyway, the point I'm making was not many people beyond New York. I mean, people were familiar with him, but obviously his influence may have not been as wide-reaching, of course, as the people that I've just listed now. And then you look at the likes of Louis Farrakhan. I mean, his message resonated in certain areas, and for all the criticism that can be leveled at the Nation of Islam, they are a community, they're an institution, and they have had a profound impact on, you know, many black lives in the US, such to the extent that, of course, the UK has also got their own form of that too. You know, there's a certain kind of institution, and I have said before in the past that, you know, when all is said and done, what is a black community? You know, there's supposed to be a certain credo that kind of knits and binds it together, you know. Some people use it interchangeably with the idea of a diaspora. If we're talking about black people outside of Africa, do you know how many diasporic communities there are with black people? We can even look at it from, like, if we're talking about the US, the various counties and states and municipalities, and also the degree of black density in any given one area. The UK, same thing, whether you're talking about the different boroughs, be it the borough of Lewisham or the borough of Southwark, or Lambeth, to name some of a few, right? And the reality is they're scattered. Even if we're going to look at like the islands that people come from, for those that have roots in the Caribbean, or maybe certain parts of the US where there are certain peculiarities, whether it is that you come from is it the Gullah Geechee people, the Low Country, Georgia and like South Carolina, I believe it is, or whether you're from the Louisiana kind of Creole space. And I'm sure, you know, where you can see where I'm going with this. There's consciousnesses which kind of like almost dovetail. Some people have multiple consciousnesses, if I'm using the word correctly, within them. You can call it like a sense of plural identity, right? So the reality is you do have that, but typically speaking, you also have instances that, like I said, are very individual to certain sets of people. So someone will say, yeah, the black community, yeah, but they're talking about something else entirely different to what another person is talking about. Okay. Now, the question comes down to this, right? I would argue when we speak about like the gender war in 2022, and I guess in the years leading up to it, and I'm talking really like in maybe like last 7 to 10 years in particular, I call this effectively a digital diaspora. What do I mean by that? So whilst, like I told you, that certain communities, I don't want to call them fragmented, but certain communities are somewhat scattered, right? But where they tend to converge, you know, from various different areas into one space: Twitter, YouTube, IG, Facebook. These are all spaces where black people are able to converge. And there are certain, I guess in a way, implied, you know, characteristics and behaviors that people tend to use to reinforce this idea of a black consciousness, you know, be it, for instance, even, for example, manosphere, to use that as an example. The reality is a lot of men from the manosphere are not indifferent to black women. So that needs to be made clear. They're not. They genuinely are not. So that in itself, you know, kind of pleading and asking for things to be a certain way, to an extent, I mean, as weird as it might sound, because like black men and black women to a certain extent are loggerheads, at least if we go by the online situation, right? But then there seems to be expectations on both sides. So there's a certain kind of consciousness. They both kind of reference certain things that have happened in the past. Many times it might actually be accurate. Other times it's selectively contextual. Other times it's completely revisionist, okay? But they still do it. Whether it comes down to having certain interests, whether there's the latest news report about someone being killed by the police, that tends to garner a lot of people together. The Black Lives Matter movement, as controversial as it was and is, that seemed to bind a lot of people across a wider geographical space. So the idea is that anything that really is seen to victimize black people, people converge on. People tend to reflect and, you know, popular culture and say, oh, do you remember such and such? Or, oh, have you seen this? That's another way that is reinforced. The idea of traveling and maybe going to different African countries, you know, maybe certain festivals, for example. You know, there's that as well. There's many different components. I won't go through all of them. I have written a book more extensively about this, but the point I'm making is that it's almost like people are somewhat double-minded. They claim, certainly, put it like this, the black populations in both the US and the UK have effectively reached a point where they're not replacing themselves. They're not 2% anymore. So they're in like a gradual decline. And that is what it is. But, you know, are the behaviors, you know, kind of part of that. In any case, that decline seems like it's going to be very gradual. And it might be so that a number of people might be able to have a certain kind of distinct presence and community where they do have an interdependence, and much of their destinies are not just intertwined in the ways that we've seen them, but there's intentional, proactive behavior that is actually engaged in, I should say, to bring about a common goal. But if you do want to argue that there is a community, it's moving at, you know, people are working at cross purposes. And the gender war is pretty much a very key part of that. You know, some people might say I'm biased of this, and I'm not. I mean, I'm really trying not to be, if I'm being honest. I'm trying to give a genuine, analysis of this. And I mean, it has to be said that much of it stemmed from feminist-based popular culture, certain things that had like a misandrist or misandric undertone, and is now just kind of bubbled up to the surface and beyond. You understand? And so from the men's side of things, a lot of it's been kind of reactionary, and it's almost like you can argue a pressure cooker effect. Certain people have been able to exchange notes with one another, and there's should I say, a certain level of resistance that has come about as a result of it. Now, I've kind of gone on for a bit, so I do appreciate your patience. I wanted to set some context, and please forgive me if parts of what I said were choppy. I just wanted to set the tone for certain reasons why things are the way they are, and why we find ourselves in the position that we do, right? I've spent a lot of it kind of going over the US case, just because that's really where the gender war kind of like its dynamic started to spill over outward and into other parts of the diaspora and the continent to varying degrees. So, this is not in any way to, implicate or indict anybody. It's just popular culture is what it is. Like I said, popular culture is at the core of the black experience, and there's no two ways about that. So anyway, when all is said and done, we're getting to a point where we're really having to face up to the reality of things. Where do we go from here? Is it a case of, for example, you have people that are passport bros, and they're willing to leave the shores of the US, and if they are going to have a life partner, finding a woman from outside of it, whether that's another black woman from another culture, or whether it's an ethnically ambiguous woman, or an Asian woman, or a Latina woman, or so on and so forth, okay? And then, with some women, they've decided that they're going to focus on swirling. There's different methods that people are undertaking, right? And I think the most important thing is, if it's going to give you happiness, fulfillment, and make you the best version of yourself, you ultimately have to do what you will do. And I think the most important thing is, if people can show each other at least surface level mutual respect, cordiality and civility, then I think that's the most important thing. Sometimes when it comes down to these, the idea of a black community, black togetherness, right? What I was going to say to you when I mentioned all those civil rights developments is that there was a cultural vacuum that arose, and the cult of celebrity was what kind of has filled it. And that cult of celebrity has just mushroomed more and more and more. So in many ways, I think the black gender dynamic is always going to be a reflection of prevailing popular culture. And so, I think that's the key thing to be aware of. So these are just really my thoughts. Forgive me again if it's all choppy, it's all over the place to a certain extent. I am still refining my content. Genuinely, I thank any of you and all of you for supporting me. And I'm just going to do my best to refine the content. I have other stuff coming. And stay tuned. Stay blessed. I wish you well. I hope you have a great day. And until next time, peace.